Welcome to the Creative Condition podcast with me, Ben Talon, illustrator and creativity coach, founder of the Creative Condition, artist and writer. I bring 20 years of creative industry experience and a lifelong love of creativity, a fundamental pillar of human happiness, to you through ongoing personal exploration and the shared experiences of others. You'll get a nourishing mix of creative industry professionals and people far and wide using creativity in ways that can take our learning to the next level so we can maximise our unique blend. The show's been supported from day one by Illustration X, a tremendous illustration agency representing a shining global roster of illustrators and animators over at illustrationx.com. The music for the show is by Dirty Freud, who you can listen to now on all good streaming services. And for everything else, for my coaching, resources and inspiration, head to thecreativecondition.com.
So I think we really kind of took it on because we had all had a lived experience somewhere, whether we were, a millennial or Gen Z or me who's Gen X, we're all in these sort of different life stages, and all of us could sort of relate. And so I think that made for very fertile creative ground.
Today I'm joined by the Vice President of Innovation and Strategy at Mark's agency, Jen Murtell. Jen and I are talking around the theme of these changing times. That wasn't the plan. We sort of went in with an angle. We talked far and wide. We got into everything from young people today, the differential between the young people we're trying to educate and our lack of ability to educate them because of these changing times. We're getting into othering. We're talking about branding by women, for women, and a lot of other cool stuff. This is the Creative Condition. How are you doing, guys? Welcome to the Creative Condition. My name is Ben Talon. I am, as ever, your host. I hope I find you well. Happy Easter if you celebrate it. We're coming in off the back of it. What's been going on with you? I hope you're feeling creative. I hope you're feeling good. We're getting into springtime now. A lot of bird song going on in the garden, which is lovely. In the morning, leave the door ajar. Don't freeze my proverbial teas off. On that note, before I go any further, let's bring in the founding sponsor of the show. A massive thank you to Illustration X, who've supported this show since its very conception in 2015. You can check them out. They're a brilliant agency representing a hell of a lot of global, incredibly talented illustrators and animators with everything in between that could possibly go under that label. They're over at illustrationx.com. They've got a fantastic news section where you can see the projects they're working on, get some insights into the relationships with the clients that they take on board. And you can also read about their wonderful work for the industry, their tree planting initiatives. There's a lot of good stuff going on with Illustration X. Go and have a look now. We've been here since day one. Massively appreciated. Sure wouldn't be possible without them. illustrationx.com. So how are you guys? How did you find Martin Ryman? Did you listen to that episode? I hope you did. Talking with a video game art director. Martin, a friend of mine, met on the dog walk here in Salisbury. I don't know what the numbers are for people I've met on the dog walk that I've brought to you on this podcast, but I think we're on about 6 or 7 at the moment. I think because I'm so open and honest about what I'm into, and I invariably get into creativity with these people who give me their time of day. It ends up bringing those stories out of people too, and as I find as I move through life, people are interesting, and even when they think they're not creative, they're doing interesting creative things, and I collar them for this show. So you can think Dan Kieran, I think that was episode 177, Sean Ryder, episode X4, infamous Happy Mondays frontman. His dog Malcolm was best friends with my dog Walter when I was living in Worsley, just out of Salford. So Martin, I met Martin with his little puppy Artie, saving his sanity, as we touched upon in that episode, talking about solitude and about building video games, making video games that you want to play yourself and taking it out to the world. Same as us artists, isn't it? Make stuff you're passionate about, make stuff that sings from your soul, and you'll find your audience. So go back and check out the archive. Countless Creativity Diary episodes to punctuate the guest ones. We had Rageshri Deriyawan recently talking to a HIV and sexual health consultant, doctor and researcher, also the author of Unheard, the medical practice of silencing, talking about deep listening. really great insights for listening and being heard in creativity in that one too. So go back and check out the archive. It's up there permanently. That's what I wanted to do, build a cache of creative insights and ways to better understand creativity. That's what I've been doing for the last 15 years, which brings me to my coaching. You can get your pit stop booked in now. I've hit my goal of doing 2 a month each month so far this year. It's still very new, but I love it, and it's been transformative for my guests. So if that sounds like something good to you, sit down, spend 3 to 4 hours working through all of your shit, everything from your process to your play, your core creativity, your environment, we look at childhood, we look at hormones if we need to, we look at community, we get into modifiers, we look at nature, diet, we go through everything, and I come back to you and I spend 4 or 5 hours writing up a report, recommended notes, and I send them on to you. I just added 2 new testimonials over at thecreativecondition.com. Head to the coaching section, thecreativecondition.com/coach, and you'll see 6 write-ups, testimonials, quotes, and insights into what work we did. There's Ryan Lewis, who used to work at Apple and Google, went out on his own, felt a little lost after some personal turbulent times, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of conformity in those jobs that he had to break, and we helped Ryan to do that. I love the coaching. You can go see new ones now by Satvia Sehota, who is a designer, and she just wanted to look at her own passion, her own emotional creativity outside of work. Hazel Mead, brilliant illustrator. We sat down and worked through a lot of heavy stuff with Hazel. We got really deep, really personal. You'll see that in the write-up. But I really love this stuff. It's somewhere between therapy and business coaching. I call it creativity coaching. It's unique to me. I care about people. I'm a total empath. And I've got 15 years worth of study, talking and practicing creativity to bring to the table. So if that sounds good, fill out the form at thecreativecondition.com/coach. I'll get back to you. We're booking a short call. We'll see if we're a good fit. And if we are, we'll go from there. I'm happy to stagger payments and whatever else makes it work for you freelancers. Also looking for agencies to work with. Let me come in and coach your staff. Let me get them firing on all cylinders, passionate about their own work, their own creativity, and therefore the work they're going to be doing at your agency. Let me know. Hit me up, ben@bentalon.com if that's easier. Happy to just get an email rather than a form, whatever works for you. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into Jen Murtell, because this was a personal favourite of an episode. Incredible stuff. So Jennifer Murtell, Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at Marks. I want to call them an agency, but they go under something different. Creative platform or something. I forget. Terrible. Anyway, cool agency doing a lot of good stuff. But Jen, involved with strategy. We get into her background. We get into a unique time of education for her. She had there's a break in her traditional education where she went to an alternative school, and the stories about that, learning convergent thinking, divergent thinking, sent us up on a hell of a tangent. And we talk about othering. We talk about the turbulence in the world at the moment and the need to move between optimism and sometimes frustration and sometimes a little pessimism, because that gives us motivation to make positive change. We get really deep about a lot of topics, and I found this an incredible conversation, one of my favourite podcasts, one of my proudest interviewer moments, because Jen was a brilliant speaker, but I felt like we just hit some real synchronicity. I was able to get a very organic, a very open, insightful interview. We talk about women designing for women. That comes through the lens of her work on the creation of Musa. Now, Musa, that's M-U-S-A. So she worked on the creation of Musa, a groundbreaking brand set to transform the landscape of women's healthcare. Musa represents a holistic by women, for women approach, filling a critical gap in a market historically underserved. Wonderful project. Great insights. The chat about that, about the need for the lived experience, is a big theme, big part of this podcast. I loved it. This is something, we got into that as an aspect of neurodivergence. I remember talking to Piers Roberts, and he was saying the importance of the conversation around neurodivergence being led by neurodivergent voices. And I think it's the same of any lived experience. We have to have people who can lead that conversation through the lived experience. It's not that that excludes other people from working on this stuff. You know, we get into my own coaching work and how I raise the importance of understanding the likes of perimenopause and hormones, but then I will push people towards actual authorities with lived experience in that area, as opposed to trying to explain something clearly that I could only possibly know through theory, you know? So we get into all that anyway. I'm rambling. It's a wonderful conversation. I really love this one. Like I said, get in touch. Get me your feedback. I love hearing from you guys. ben@bentalon.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm going to be getting back to you much quicker on the email, so I'm old school like that. But thank you for listening. If you get a second, please do tell a friend about the show. It helps massively. Rate, review, subscribe. I say it every episode. I don't always do it for the podcasts I listen to, but I will be immensely thankful if you could do that, because it really helps to validate what is a relatively small podcast to new potential listeners and spread that cause of championing creativity at societal level. Nice one, guys. Here's my conversation with Mark's Vice President of Innovation and Strategy, Jennifer Murtell.
I feel like when we work in commerce, we get, it's so easy to get disconnected from your creative roots. It is so easy, you know. For example, I'm a painter, right? Mm-hmm. Back when I was in school, there weren't really structured programs in uni for strategy, for brand strategy, for innovation strategy. They exist now, which is terrific, because it's wonderful to kind of recruit young, crazy, smart brains from these programs, right? But when I was in school, there weren't these programs. So my education is actually in photo media and mixed media. So I kind of tripped into my job. I was very fortunate. I was so fortunate that I found something that I'm relatively good at. I really enjoy. My brain feels very occupied, right, and active doing this work. But it does pull you out of your creative mode often, because there are lots of hats that you have to wear. And, you know, ultimately capital is the thing that, you know, is the reason your job exists, right? And so, yeah, it's very easy to kind of disconnect. So I've been enjoying your podcast just because I feel like it reconnects me, especially when I'm too busy. It does remind me that I have this inner creative life, right? That I'm not tapping into enough. Yeah. Yeah.
It's something that comes up with every I'm only about a year into working with people on a coaching level, but it's something that comes up time and time again, is that people have kind of disconnected from that inner magic. I like to term it as emotional creativity, the stuff that we just need to do because we need to make, and we have something inside of us that needs to come out.
Yes.
And but once I always take them back to really small goals. You know, let's start doing it 15 minutes one night a week, and nothing rests on that. You just do it. But the momentum is really empowering and incredible. And it's funny because when I go and talk to agencies about potentially working with them, I always encounter that sort of thing of, you do realize we work with commercial clients. And I'm like, yeah, my whole 18 years as an illustrator has been with commercial clients, of course. But if you disconnect the pure creativity from the day-to-day stuff, you don't get the best ideas in your day-to-day stuff. And actually, if you feel more empowered as a human, as an artist, you're likely to come in with better spirit. You see the world more optimistically. Yeah. There's a lot of benefits that are not directly related to the day job, but still empower it. You know.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. I feel like you know, to the respect, we don't honor our creativity enough in culture. And I think if you want to talk about sort of background, right? There are things that I was really fortunate to have access to as a kid growing up that I think really made a huge difference for me. And every time I see a kid who is struggling with some of the same things that I struggled with growing up, you know, my heart really goes out to them. And I wish that our educational systems just had a better handle on that sort of the transversal way that kids learn things, right? You know, we don't learn in discrete sort of pillars of information, you know, and especially now with you know, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, their brains are markedly cognitively different than ours, right? And we're not keeping up, right? The acceleration of technology, the pace of change in the way that they see the world, the way that they make meaning. They're meaning makers and they're meaning consumers, right? And they have this feedback loop that they're constantly engaged in, and it's just different. The way that they synthesize and analyze information is outrageous. I talk to these junior strategists coming out of university now, and I'm just like, I'm stunned by how smart and talented they are, just in their synthesis skills, right? And their ability to sort of, connect dots, tell stories about those dots, and understand what is meaningful in the connections, right? Um, but growing up, I was raised in a small town in southern Ontario. Um, to working class parents. So glad that I was raised by working class folks, because it really taught me some excellent lessons. I am inherently a hard worker, I think partly because of that. But I went to an alternative school from like grades 5 through 8, which in Canada would be like 11, 10 to the last year that you sort of transition to high school. So 10 to 14, 10 to 13, 4 years. And this alternative school it was an experiment. But it really kind of tapped into cognitive, the way that kids' brains work, the thinking skills that you need to learn how to think, not just what to think, you know. So on Mondays, for example, we would do divergent thinking. On Tuesdays, we would do uh, um, convergent thinking. On Wednesdays, we would learn all about critical thinking skills and building arguments and faulty logic and things like that. And then on Thursdays, we play strategy games all day. So in a weird way, I sort of by default, I got this fantastic strategic education at a really, really young age. And when I look back on that, I can't imagine not teaching children how to think, you know? And I think it does impact your creativity, because if you learn how to think, you learn how to create those connections that are, I think, inherently creative, right? Seeing seemingly disparate things and creating sort of this network of ideas that start to make sense when you connect the dots, it's an inherently creative act. Um, and Marx, the agency that I work with, we call strategy a creative practice as well. So
Well, it very much is. You're absolutely right.
yeah,
That seeing those layers and seeing that those wide disconnects is maybe it's the genesis of creativity, but it is critically important.
yeah. I also think of something that David Lynch once said, R.I.P. R.I.P. David Lynch.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaker, that one.
I cried. I cried. Um, but he's a wonderful example of that. He has this rare ability to tap into the unconscious. He believes in the collective unconscious, I believe. I think what is he, he's deep into that meditation practice. What's it called? Transcendental meditation.
Mm,
He's a
yeah.
big he was a big practicer of that, but he once used this analogy of creativity, sort of the ideas, this collective, pool of ideas being like an ocean or a body of water, and the deeper you fish into sort of this collective unconscious, the more powerful the ideas, right? But also the more abstract. And so I have always found his work really fascinating, because not only is it sort of, cognitively inspiring, because, a lot of his work is about identity and about what identity really is and how people build identities, how identities become fractured, you know,
Hmm.
which I think is particularly important for Gen Z right now. Gen Z are experiencing tremendous fracturing of identity because of technology, right? But but also just his ability to take seemingly disparate things and make sense of those two things, and understand and sort of interrogate the relationship between seemingly disparate things, um, is, some of the most creative work that I've ever seen in our lifetime. You know, um, Now translating that into commerce is much more difficult, right? Because people want things to be explicit. They need to, you know, brands and companies need to be able to measure things. It needs to be, we need metrics and yardsticks to sort of understand how people are going to respond to things. And I think, that's where I think capital or commerce and creativity can sometimes come to a bit of a stalemate.
The two don't have to be completely disconnected, but it takes work, it takes bravery, it takes vision to enable those things in commerce. You need
Yeah.
brave leaders. You need the ability to have conversations, the empathy to understand humans, to do that with clients, to bring them on
Hmm.
board for brave
Hmm.
thinking. You'll know this better than I, but I think that you hit on something really important there, and it's the lack of that in education does not lay the groundwork for that to happen in later years. So I guess just to touch upon that a little bit, I wanted to ask you, because that's an interesting age to encounter convergent and divergent thinking. I think a really powerful and important age because we aren't yet completely conditioned. Maybe kids more now because of technology, but I think that the brain is very fertile at that age. It obviously hasn't finished developing. Did
Yes.
you find that it enabled you to help to understand yourself and the world at large through encountering those different ways of thinking and the exercises
Yes.
in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I went through a long period, I think, in my young life, late teens, early 20s, where, after that program, which just felt like such a such an opening up of my brain, right? Like I remember feeling like exhilarated by having my sort of brain cracked open, right? And then we were all kind of restreamed into public high school. And a lot of us, and it's funny, I have very few friends from high school, but I have deep connected relationships with the kids that I went to this alternative school with, right? Um, and I would say half of us kind of fell apart, because it was such a, I think it was just it was sort of a intellectual and emotional disappointment, right? To sort of go back to a world where you learn geography on Wednesdays and you learn history on Fridays, and you had phys ed and you had to learn how to make a lamp in shop class. That was a shift that I think we all didn't make successfully. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, but I think what it demonstrates is that rift, right? That rift between, um, what our brains are capable of, and sort of the paradigm that the sort of lowest common denominator paradigms that we, as a collective culture, that we're, sort of exposed to, or that we are limited by, right, as we grow
Mhm.
up. So yeah.
Do you find that I find it really interesting now that we're at a real moment in history, I feel, with the generational divide because of the sheer ubiquity, but also the sheer acceleration of technology. It's mind blowing stuff that's going on,
Yeah.
and I feel like the conversations are finally starting to happen around what has been a Wild West era of access to technology. I recently read the Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you're
Oh
aware of
yeah.
it.
Yes, yes, yes.
As a parent of two 5-year-olds, it's what that book has helped to do as part of a broader conversation is trigger a lot of conversations in the playground through WhatsApp groups now, where there's a lot of parents who are very alarmed by this stuff coming out of it, and we're sort of beginning conversations with heads. That's exciting. You can either look at the downside of all of that stuff, or you can look at the excitement of that. Now these conversations are happening, and through culture, there's shows like Adolescence, which is big on Netflix at the moment, that is addressing that issue.
Yes, yes.
Question I'm sort of driving at is from someone such as yourself who's been in the industry a little while. how do you find that with the new people sort of coming into the industry? Because where's the common ground? And I don't know. I don't really have a question, but I guess you know what I'm driving at.
Yeah, it's and I'll and my sort of anchor to this issue that you're bringing up is watching the TikToks post pandemic. I think the pandemic has been a very easy scapegoat for more systemic problems, right? It's easy to blame the pandemic on, children's lack of being able to socialize, or, children's inability to, negotiate social situations, right? But I think that the problem is larger than that. And when you follow some of these TikToks of teachers, right? I don't know if you've seen this, Ben, but like teachers going on TikTok saying, this is an emergency, children can't learn, right? They they understand information in 5-second increments. I can't teach a class. They're on their phones. They don't know how to talk to each other. They don't have the ability to learn. And the more I thought about it, the more I just thought, no, we don't know how to teach anymore. We
Mm.
we have we've exposed children. I don't know if you've seen the Social Dilemma documentary that came out a few years ago. Oof, it's devastating. I had to take a couple days off of just
Yeah.
thinking afterwards because it was so devastating. But you know, they in this documentary they talk about tracking, self-esteem, right, issues, particularly with girls, but with both girls and boys, right? Their exposure to a technology that that lights up the addictive parts of our pleasure centers in our brains. Simon Sinek talks about this too, right? This idea that, you know, we lock our, traditionally, we lock our liquor cabinets, right? To protect our kids. We try and educate them about drugs. We try and educate them about so many things that we understand are dangerous. But part of the generational divide, which has been, I think caused in part by just the radical acceleration of technology and tools and platforms, right? These kids understand these tools. Their parents don't, right?
Hmm.
Um, there's a comedian who has a sort of a running bit that he does about like begging his boomer parents to just put down their iPads, right? Because they're not equipped to make these sometimes nuanced sort of decisions around what's true and what's not true, or what's a scam and what's not a scam, right? And children, this is their world, right? And we've given them access to this technology that has massively addictive properties, right? And damages their self-esteem and changes the way that changes the fundamental way that their brains, like I said, synthesize information, right? So on one hand, it's made them really great analysts, really great dot connectors, right? But on the other hand, it's crippling their ability to learn inside of a system that desperately needs to be updated, and that is guided by people who don't understand the actual landscape that the children are being raised in through the lens of technology, right?
Hmm.
So um so the more I saw these TikToks with teachers, and no malice intended, no cynicism. They're trying to raise an alarm, right? And they're misunderstanding the problem, I feel, right? And the problem is that if their brains, as cognitive scientists are suggesting, right? If Gen Z and then further on Gen Alpha brains are a marked evolutionary step in a different direction, right? Um, we're not accommodating that at all. And we don't even know how to, because we live in a different paradigm than they do, right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
I think so. And I think that I've, throughout history, artistic expression, I believe, is a fundamental. Um, I think it's a necessity to as a tool to understand ourselves and to communicate and connect. And I think now more than ever it is needed, because the stuff that, like you said, the stuff they're being exposed to which badly needs restricting, in the sense that the brain is still developing until we're 21.
Hmm.
And I dread to think, looking back at, I've been exposed at 10, 11, 12, 13, whatever, to the stuff now that kids are being given access to. Then in that situation, artistic expression is vital. You know, whether it's
Yes.
dance, whether it's drama, just things that facilitate community and a broader vehicle for learning through physical intelligences, through
Yeah.
tolerance. Well, you know, there's a massive problem with tolerance at the moment, of course, and I think that it's all linked. It's all linked, and I
Yeah.
think that these sort of young minds that are exposed to too much too soon are being exploited. I think this all links into what we're going to get to with the work that you're doing, um,
Yeah.
around women in branding, because you can't disconnect. There's a big. I was listening the other day. I don't know if you know Stephen Bartlett, the Diary of a CEO podcast, but it's
Mm.
fantastic. And he did a really great episode on that, on the sort of male problem at the moment, what's happening with our young men.
Yeah.
Because the role of a guy has changed dramatically in this generation too. And the community, the lack of community spaces, the lack of ability to express frustrations, and just again, just technology and these toxic role models that
Yes. Oh, I know.
all of that feeds in then to what we're going to discuss, because it's all linked, isn't it? The societal perception of the genders by each other, and it's. But I think that at the core of all this, with community spaces and with artistic expression, you would have a great equalizer, or at least
Mhm.
outlet, and
Mhm.
something to come
Mhm.
together through positivity that would help people to look one another in the eye and understand that we're not all that different.
Yeah. 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 And I agree with you. This is a multi-pronged problem, right? And and an intersectional problem, right? Which is, I think, something that a lot of people in the broadest sense don't really understand, you know. But through the lens of feminism, this notion of intersectionality becomes, quite important and quite meaningful, right? And in the sense that, and you read the article that I wrote about women marketing for women and women's
Yeah,
products, right? And that article was actually inspired by a piece of work that we did, a brand invention for a brand called Musa, MUSA, which is sort of the first supplement brand in Europe uh, that really engages women in transparency and education and understanding and solutions at every single stage of their lives and every single stage of their bodies' lives, right? And I think the sort of the broad framing of that is the landscape of our culture, the paradigms of our culture have been built for men, right? And um and so consequently men are sort of the default setting, right?
mhm,
And that's where this notion of otherness, othering comes from, right? If you aren't part of that default setting in one of the paradigms that we, live inside of from a cultural standpoint, um, you are other, and you're other by default. It's not necessarily by malice, it's that the system doesn't have a place for you, right? And so everything that kind of defies that default culture setting, um, is just because of the complacency of the default, right? And so to add to that, for women, right, the economic system the paradigm, our economic paradigm is also, the default, the dominant default role is men, right? And so consequently women's bodies are commodities in our system, right? And and that means we're ultimately products to be consumed, as much as we wish that were no longer true, and as much as we, sometimes we feel many steps away from that sort of that old third wave feminism notion, right? That women are commodities and that capitalism and feminism will always sort of hit this stalemate position, right? Um, we like to think that we're not there anymore, but we see examples of the time where capitalism will sacrifice women's bodies, women's agency, sort of to the gods of capital every time, right? Every time. And so that's where that stalemate comes from. It's also where some of the insight-driven inspiration for the that Musa project came from, right? Because what we heard from consumers, from female consumers, was, you know, men don't, my doctor doesn't listen to me. You know, the healthcare system doesn't acknowledge me. Nurofen, also, I don't know if you know the brand, the Nurofen
Yeah,
brand.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I do.
So they did that campaign all around pain and women, and it's because the data shows that doctors underestimate women's pain and women's complaints of pain, right? Women's testimony of pain. So essentially, we're not believed,
Hmm.
right? And so to create a brand that spoke to women in a way about healthcare in a way that actually addressed some of the gaps in the system, in the default system, right? The gaps of the default was actually quite a radical act. And we didn't really expect it to feel like a radical act, but it did feel that way, right? So the team that worked on it was completely female. So everything from strategists to design, the design team to the client service and the planners, everybody was female. And it was quite a an eye-opening, I think, experience for all of us um, to work that way, and to recognize too how relevant and how consumer meaningful and how resonant the work ended up being because we worked that way. Does that make sense?
Well, it absolutely makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
I'm a believer that the lived experience, maybe on a par with personality, is the most powerful asset in creativity.
Mm,
And if you can't, a campaign like that. Well, of course, that lived experience is absolutely critical. I'm, I've got I don't know if you're aware of Maisie Hill's work, but Maisie Hill's, she's got many books. One's Period Power, one is
oh
Perimenopause
yes,
Power.
yes, yeah,
She's a leading with work around hormones for women in the UK.
yes,
I've got her
yes.
coming up on the show. And quite quickly after she agreed to come on the show in a few months' time, I thought there's something missing from this conversation. There's only so much that I can bring as a guy who has. So just to give you a little backstory, around the age of 14, when my mum noticed I was starting to take an interest in girls, she borderline pinned me up against the wall and said, right, you listen to me now. There's this thing that happens once a month. It's profound. It's real. You need to respect it. And she'd get laid out the
Yeah,
periods and the menstrual cycle and everything. And therefore, from that point, and I'm totally empathetic. I'm a very sensitive guy. So I'm always very, very mindful and willing to listen and wanted to understand more about that. All that said, there's only so much I can do without that lived experience. So I called my friend Joanna Henley, who's a wonderful artist, and she's also a coach, and she coaches female creatives. And I knew she was deep in the perimenopause, deep in discovering what it was that it had been affecting her for years. And she told me
mm,
about all these CEOs who'd had to take like 1, 2 years out of work to manage it because it was just so
wow,
impactful in their
yeah,
lives. So I
mm,
asked Jo to co-host the episode with me because she could bring something to that conversation and
it's a
engage
great
with Maisie
idea.
on a level that I just absolutely couldn't. And I'm not putting any kind of badge of honor on myself there. I just think you have to respect the people who are living such important experiences in that way. I hear the same
Mhm.
conversation in the neurodivergent community, saying that these conversations have to be led by neurodivergent people.
Yes.
So I think that's really, really important and brilliant that you brought together that team to work on that. That said, can you give me an example of some of the conversations within that process and that project or the dynamics within the personalities within that project? Because that really fascinates me.
Yeah. Also, we had a brilliant client. Her name is Helen Tomlinson. She really kind of spearheaded this and believed in this idea of the brand, right? And so it was very, very much a collaborative effort and an iterative effort, right? And because it was a brand invention, we had to consider every single building block along the way, from naming, right, to to how we talk about the sort of the life stages at the gates of women's lives. And we had to listen a lot. We had to listen to consumers very, very closely, very carefully. And I think we were so inspired by what we heard from the consumer. Excuse me. And we were so inspired and kind of very motivated by some of the tensions and some of the disappointments, right, that we heard. Um, and at first we thought, oh my God, this is quite daunting, actually. This feels like such a big problem that I don't know if we can even drive authenticity for a brand to address some of these problems, because the problems are sociocultural. The problems are feminist problems, even though we didn't want to use any polarizing language, right? I personally don't think that feminist language is polarizing language, but a lot of people do, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people feel that we live in a post-feminist world and that there's no need. And I think that sidebar, what's happening in America definitely proves that we're not that far away, right,
Mhm.
um, from third wave feminist literature, from Germaine Greer and Female Eunuch, and yeah, right. Um, but we had to find the optimism. We had to find the sort of the North Star, the guiding light for this work. And I think what really inspired us and got that sort of the creative dynamic, was that we had all had that same experience, right? This, like, back to what you're saying about lived experience, was that we weren't just listening to consumers and trying to put ourselves in their shoes. We were listening to consumers and going, oh my God, my doctor last week, you know? Um, or he doesn't want to send me for blood tests, or he doesn't think that this is important enough, or he's asking me to wait, or whatever. Or like, I looked for this product and I couldn't find anything, and I couldn't find any information. Um, so I think we really kind of took it on because we had all had a lived experience somewhere, whether we were, a millennial or Gen Z, or me, who's Gen X. We're all in these sort of different life stages, and all of us could sort of relate. And so I think that made for very fertile creative ground,
Mhm.
right? And it also gave us the voice to lend to the brand, that was inherently focused and single-minded, and um, really embodied all of the problems that women are faced with when they are faced with a healthcare system, or a doctor that doesn't really, that is not listening, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And I think that even just the principle of that, women not being listened to, I think resonates regardless of whether you're, dealing with healthcare, or another sphere. Um, we had a panel talk a couple of weeks ago at work, um, for International Women's Day, and I spoke on one of the panels, and one of the questions was, what um, what advice would you give your younger self, right? Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self? And I knew the answer right away from my perspective, and that is, give zero energy to people that will not champion you, right? I have so many amazing male champions in my life, and I love them dearly. But there are spheres of your life where you are going to come up against men who are not going to champion you. And the advice that I would have given my younger self was, don't put any of your energy towards people that aren't going to champion you. So, and we all know that feeling. The feeling in your gut when you're faced with someone who's not receptive, when you're faced with someone who, you know, um, doesn't necessarily think that there's like a place for you, right? Back to that othering conversation that we had earlier.
Mhm.
You
Yep.
know, especially men in leadership positions, right? Like, if they have everything that they need, and they have, this other who also has something to contribute, but it doesn't actually fit into the equation perfectly, or it looks different. It is other, right?
Yep.
The default is going to be, maybe it's inconvenient to find room for this other, right? This person who thinks differently, this this person full of different ideas, right? And I think that's where the DEI conversation, lives. The sort of the politicization of the DEI conversation, especially in America, I think that lives there. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's great advice that you would have given to your younger self. Um, you're absolutely right. Um, I'm also interested in the kind of the funding. You mentioned again earlier the default male thing in economics, and I don't know if you heard the episode I did a couple of weeks ago with Rageshri Deriyawan, who she's written a fantastic book called "Unheard: The Medical Practice of Silencing," which is on exactly what you've just talked about, not being heard in healthcare.
Amazing.
If you haven't, it's must read. It's a brilliant book. Rageshri is a HIV and sexual health doctor and consultant and researcher, and she suffered horrendous endometriosis pain and wasn't heard. And that was the genesis of this book idea. She's
Yeah.
from Indian heritage. And so for a number of reasons, and she's the loveliest human, but for a number of reasons, her husband had to fight her corner in the hospital to get her seen for the chronic
Yeah.
pain she was
Yeah.
suffering.
Yeah.
What I find really exciting and encouraging is the creative spark that caused through adversity for Rageshri in this book that is now in the world. And the moment I learned about that book, I just had to have her on the show. Thankfully, she was very open to that, and we had a great chat. But
it's incredible. Yeah.
one of the points she raised, and I found this particularly interesting because my wife and we went through IVF to have our twins, and she suffered endometriosis, which was the part of the reason for that. So again, I've been on this learning path myself through her experience and been the supporter in that and the champion that you speak of. And when Rageshri talked about how it's still this condition that we know so little about, and part of the reason for that is because a lot of the funding model within healthcare is very much top-down male.
Yes.
And therefore there's less allocation for such a condition that is not understood or lived or experienced.
We were sort of exposed to that same information, right? That there is not the investment and funding in research for women's bodies, for women's healthcare experiences, right? Which causes this vacuum in information, right? There's women were desperate for better information, about hormone health, about understanding menstrual cycles. There's no sort of baseline empirically true and championed information, database or repository of information on these things. And so what we heard from consumers is you are you're sort of victim to whatever your doctor knows or doesn't know, right? So yeah, that must have been an awesome conversation to have.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. She's a wonderful woman, but even more so, I recommend the book more than my podcast with her. I love the podcast, but the book is something else, and it's absolutely fantastic. So to take this back to branding, I find this really interesting because I've jumped through a few little hoops myself recently, just in terms of I had some lows during early parenthood, just from being completely fatigued and feeling the weight of the world and blah blah blah. What helped me out of that and helps to keep me on a better track now is the belief in small changes and the belief in the power of creativity, but in the smallest sense. But also, I go through it because one thing that comes up in all of my coaching sessions with people are their insurmountables. And I speak about, so in the instance of some of my female clients, they're very concerned about this rise of misogyny that's happening at the moment.
Yes,
and very valid concerns, but I also think that part of the reason that is rising up is because of the progression in understanding and the work that people like yourself are doing. I think it's really important, and I think that the more that rises to prominence, the more that freaks out the old guard, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think so we're seeing this gripping on at the moment. I think that's part of the reason as to what's going on. So, in a position as yourself as a strategist on these projects, do you also believe in the power of this work? Because my younger self might have looked at this or advertising and gone and been cynical about its role within the capitalism. But yeah, now older and wiser, I realize we all have to exist in this system. So of course we have to find ways to make money with this stuff. At the
Mm,
same time, I think a truly great brand is attuned with something very real and very authentic. It captures a person's problem, a person's lived experience, and it deals with that very diligently and
mhm,
effectively. And that's
mhm.
what you're doing with this great work. So I guess my question is, do you, because it all has to line up, what we talked about earlier, education, the male problem, the female problem, it all has to line up. However, within we all have our areas of working. Therefore, I think, do you believe in the power of branding and the power of these kind of changes and transformative shifts? Even when all that stuff's going on, the heavy headline stuff, I personally believe that we can still be working away. We can still be making smaller changes,
Yeah,
behaving in a way that we want to see others behave in the world. I think that we can still progress and still
yeah.
make positive change despite all of that. Do you?
I that is a really, really hard question, right? In this era of just the acceleration of all things, right? There are days when I believe in it very, very passionately, and there are days when my belief absolutely wavers. And I actually think that that's the right place to be, right? Because when you live in that liminal space between, belief and disbelief in some of the systems that we live in, I think you're able to always take a step back and interrogate, right? And I think that interrogation it is a, I mean, for me, it is anyway, it's a very, very creative act, right? Now, I interrogation is kind of is my default. I was diagnosed with autism about, I don't know, eight years ago or so. So I got a very adult, late in life um, uh, diagnosis. Um, and it made a lot of things make sense in terms of how my brain works, and how I grew up, and why that education that I had at a very young age was so sticky for me, right? So things made sense. But I also think that it gives me that a little bit of a superpower in terms of that interrogation, right? And um I think I think that interrogation sometimes lands you on the, yes, we can affect change from within, right? And it also sometimes lands you outside of that, saying, I don't know if we can make change from within, but I think that's okay. You know what I mean? I think it's okay to kind of have one foot in both of those spaces, because that interrogation, that space that we leave for ourselves, right? It gives us the space to step out. It gives us the mental space to step outside of the paradigm. And I think stepping outside of a paradigm is that the hardest thing to do for human beings, right? Because we want sense, we want order, we want the world to make sense, right? And the world makes less and less and less sense right now. Yeah. And so our ability to interrogate is outrageously important. It's become more and more and more important, right? Um, so that's a complex answer to your question. Do I believe in it? Sometimes. Do I
Mhm.
sometimes not? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, but at the same time, I think that makes me good at my job.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Um, and it also lets me kind of look at every situation with those fresh eyes, to say, is this a place where we can make a positive impact? Is this a place where we can poke at the status quo? Is this an opportunity for us to tell a different story, and have that story really resonate, right? Um, I think that that's the most thrilling part of my job. Um, it sometimes makes me the hero, and it sometimes makes me the villain. And I have to be okay with that. And that's probably the hardest part of my job, right? Is that I'm not going to be for everyone. And back to that, conversation that we were having earlier about like find your champions, um, I have to be comfortable with because autism, right? I have no sense of what others think of me. And I think that I can't wrap my head around it. It's very, very difficult for me, right? So I had to make peace at some point in my life with the idea that like I have to walk through the world just being me. And, you know, and sometimes that is, uncomfortable for other people. And sometimes it is the thing that like, the agency that you work for is like, oh my God, she wrote this amazing article, or oh my God, she wrote this article. What are we going to do about it? Right.
Yeah.
And I think in my old age I've gotten comfortable with that liminal space of being in between, of not really caring what others think, because there's something there's a more important interrogation, right, to engage. Yeah.
It's a vital skill. It's something I'll be placing great emphasis on in raising my children.
Mhm.
As I was blessed with a mum who was very much. I look back now and I think my mum is neurodivergent. I have no doubt in the matter, and I think that played a part in the fact that she very much raised me, in a small post-industrial working class town. It wasn't the done thing to wear the clothes she wore and the clothes she had me wearing, but she very much gave me the courage to go out and own that as part of my identity, and
Yeah.
never care
Yeah.
what others think, and very empowering, particularly for someone who would go on to work in the creative industry. Also, like I have a friend on my local dog walk, Andy, who's an engineer, recently diagnosed autistic too, as he's close to 40 now, and he's a tonic in the morning. I love his company. You get it, he shoots straight every single time. Again, he's not for everyone, but I adore his company, and I think he's fantastic, and I
Yeah.
really just love everything
Yeah.
about him. Yeah, I could go on about him all day, but but also to your point about good days and bad days, in terms of belief, and I agree with you. I think that liminal space is absolutely vital. When I look back after low periods, I realized that that's what gave me guided me to the tenacity I needed to pull myself out of a particular low. And when I do, I tend to come out firing, and I come out with renewed belief in certain things, less in others. But ultimately, it shapes my creativity and where I point my energy. And
Yeah.
but I believe anything
100%.
from a
100%.
I
Yeah.
believe anything from a smile to a stranger in the street, right through to creating an exciting piece of work that inspires another creative. I think that we can't know the effects of our behaviors that they have, creatively or otherwise. But I
Mm,
think that's really great because it stops you from having to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, and know
it
that actually,
does.
if you just behave in the world that the way you want to see others behave,
Yeah.
that's as profound as anything else. We don't all have to be on the front line with a placard, or any one form of activism. I think
Right.
activism can come in any form.
There's less and less room for that space, right, in the world, in in corporate life, in in pretty much every sphere. There's less and less room for you to kind of take um, a sort of agnostic stance on something, and to be able to really look at it with plain eyes, right? And what I always say about strategy is that strategy is, it carries a lot of baggage, the word strategy, right? And but ultimately I feel like we are truth tellers, right? We we help we help our teams understand what's true. We help our clients understand what's true, and what's true is not always what's comfortable. And I think that getting back to the idea of, can we make powerful change from within a system, right? The old SLC Punk quote, I didn't sell out, son, I bought in, right?
Yeah.
I think about this all the time, right? Where, you have to tell the truth. And maybe that's kind of like who I am, part of my identity, part of my autism. I don't know what that is. But if you ask me to not tell the truth on a project, I can't do it. I am not, I will not be successful. Right. And so I think that truth telling is the part that I feel is the altruistic act
Mhm.
in my job. There are a lot of things that are not altruistic about marketing and about advertising and branding. And I think sometimes people either double down or they fold, right? And I think the hard right thing to do is to stay in, but to negotiate, right? What the truth really is. And I think that after the pandemic, this is such a great example. During the pandemic, I don't know if you noticed this, but during the pandemic, I felt like LinkedIn went bananas. Like LinkedIn became this weird sort of Roman Colosseum, this high stakes, it became this place where it was like kind of the only place that people in corporate life and business life could really engage. And I saw these patterns, right? I saw people either doubling down like crazy, um, you know, um, denying what was happening out in the world, denying the implications, denying what was true about the world at that point, right? And then you saw the sort of every sociocultural trend, right, is a giant pendulum swing. There is no one thing that happens. There's a pendulum swing of responsive, right? We're gonna respond to this sociocultural shift, right? Or we're gonna react, right? And the reaction is sometimes the putting my heels in, I don't welcome this change, right? And the response is, I welcome this change, and here's how I'm dealing with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that reactive, like post 9/11 is a great one. I did a great backcast on after 9/11. There was this reactive, right, sort of neo-nihilist space, which was actually a really good space. It was a really rich space, because people were questioning their reality, right? Um, so you saw it in fashion, like the same year that Comme des Garçons made like a whole fall collection that was deconstructed military jackets, right? After 9/11 happened. Um, exposed seams, exposed stitching, inside out elements. You could see sort of the construct of the jacket, right? At the same time, you had, I think it might have been Karl Lagerfeld's last year at Chanel, right? Doing this huge spring summer show, that was 1940s and 50s sort of pastel, dreamy cocktail dresses. It looked like a 1950s prom, the show. And these two things were happening at the same time. And it's because people were reacting in this sort of neo-nihilistic questioning way, questioning everything, questioning government, questioning truth and reality, right? And then this other response, which was, I just want to be safe. I want to go back to a time when things were simpler, right? When
Mm-hmm.
things were more idyllic, right? I want the halcyon days, right? And you see that kind of play out all the time. And so now with sociocultural things just accelerating like crazy, climate change, we have geopolitical, instability, we've got economic instability, everybody is just kind of like vacillating, like Gen Z vacillating between these two behaviors, neo austerity, like they're using banking apps, investment apps, budgeting apps more than ever, earlier than any other generation before them. But they're also having this reactive, which actually comes from anger, right? Um, I call it YOLO FOMO life, right? They're so scared of missing out on the life that they feel they deserve the time and the space to build, and they maybe don't have that time and space, right? And so they're also splurging on crazy leather. They're doing all the drugs. They're going on all the trips.
Mm-hmm.
They're ordering the caviar. And they're doing these two things at the same time, right? Um, and so it's crucial to be able to tell the truth of these things, right? And not just put a sheen that everything is okay, right?
Yeah.
I don't know where I was going with that. I totally went down a rabbit hole. I
No,
apologize.
no, I love it. It's fantastic. I love it, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, the tension of all of those things is really tangible. You know,
Yeah.
you've got, like I said, you got the nostalgia overload, and then you've got, but then at the same time, all this crazy new stuff with AI, and it's like, oh my God, what a time to be
Yeah.
alive, you know?
Mm, 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 mhm. Yeah. But
Trying to
back
make
to the,
sense of that.
like, through the lens of that, of the sort of, creating products for women, right? Um, those same sort of vacillations happen. You see it, Um, yeah. So you just have to be able to kind of cut through what's the easy answer, right? And resist the easy answer to find the true answer. And back to your original question, sometimes I feel like that is a radical act, or when I say radical act, I mean it positively. I mean, like, it could it instigate positive change? Sometimes absolutely yes, to tell the truth, right? So can it, if teams or clients aren't willing to go there, then back to not being able to do something without it being truthful, I have a really difficult time feeling like you can make change that way. You know,
Yeah,
yeah.
because as we said before, it rests on everything else, doesn't it? No matter, it doesn't matter how good a work any one sector does, if everything else is resisting, then
Mm,
it happens in a bubble. So
mhm, mhm, mhm.
so yeah,
Absolutely.
so we need the support of education. We need the support of technology companies. You know, everything kind of has to ultimately come to the table for any of this to work in the long term.
One thing I will say about creativity and Gen Z, is that I'm working on a very, very big sort of intelligence report about we're calling it youth futures. And so we're trying to find places to engage young people. And late last year, we went to Dutch Design Week, which is an amazing, very, very comprehensive, and very sort of holistically defined, right? Um, expo of design. So grad students, um, teachers, design organizations, design agencies, things like that. And they were all, and so we went and interviewed a number of grad students. We looked at their work, and I think you'll probably be very inspired to know that the tension between creativity and technology played out in all of their work. Like, it was so powerful to see. They're grappling with tensions like looking back and looking forward, right? What can I pull from my heritage that is valuable, that is inspiring, that is creative, right? And how do I reframe it to equip me, to prepare me for this unknown future, right? Um, I think like overarchingly, the theme of the show last year was real unreal, right? Which I think it really embodies the broadest tension that these consumers, I keep wanting to say kids, they're not kids, they're not kids anymore, but these kids are experiencing, right? Is the unknowable that lies in front of them, right? And how do they take the knowable and tool it to prepare themselves for the future? And so that's why you kind of see a lot of that, the pendulum swing behaviors, right? The I'm doing this and this, right? These aren't two separate cohorts. These are the same kids doing, seemingly paradoxical behaviors, right?
Yeah.
But what we saw just overwhelmingly was this sort of reconnection with craft, right? Taking traditional craft, whether they were culturally traditional crafts or just crafts my grandmother did, like crochet, um, um, origami, knitting, sewing, pottery. They're taking these very analog, very, very tactile, creative, mediums, right? And they're telling stories about the future through these mediums. And to me, that was incredibly inspiring, because it showed me that they understand this tension. They understand how technology, both influences them, and influences their creativity, but the tension of not letting it take over, the tension of not letting it be the creative vision, right? Um, and their need for sort of human centric solutions to, world problems, their need for at least a sense of human control, right? And a connection to human creativity, human making, right? These kids were makers. And it was really fascinating to see people inside of a design practice engaging in engaging with clay, engaging with
Yeah.
weaving, engaging with and also merging it with technology. There was one girl who I think you would absolutely, love to see her project. I'll send you a link to it. But she was in digital design and she wanted to be a game designer, but she really she had a strong political feeling about the way that games are sort of designed algorithmically to sort of tap into those reward centers in our brains, right?
Yeah.
And so she was committed to creating video games that didn't use any of those algorithms. And so her games feel a little pointless, right? They feel a little bit they're really just sensory experiences, right? Because
Wow.
there's nothing to win. There's nothing that is going to reward you for doing X and hitting Y button, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but when she took those constraints off, and those are capitalist constraints, right?
Yeah.
Those are neoliberal constraints. These are the paradigm constraints of our culture, right? She removed those, and suddenly, this experience that you had with her technology interface was a deeply creative, um, a deeply creative practice. Like it was just it was incredible. Yeah,
Wow, that is incredibly
yeah, yeah,
inspiring. And all of the things you just said there, it does fill me with hope. And that's the thing, that's why I think it's really important to nourish our minds with both. Because, like my wife subscribed me to Positive News magazine at Christmas. It's kind of an illustration in its own right of where my head was at. But it's beautiful because you sometimes have to feel that pain and that like we talked
yeah.
about there, the downside of things, to come out the other side and do and make better actions. So to hear that generation of people are being so creative and so innovative and imaginative to make
Hmm.
projects like that does fill me with optimism.
But
Yeah.
what was really cool, like back to this notion of interrogation, it's because they're using creativity to interrogate the world, right?
Hmm.
It's not just like I think with millennials, the creative act was more about identity building and crafting my brand, right? Because they're more bought in. They're more bought into the system. Gen Z are questioning the system, and so they're using creativity as a tool of interrogation,
Hmm.
interrogating the world around them. Um, and I found that very, very inspiring. I was like, okay, they're doing something right. Like this is they're coming to this truth telling through creativity, um, in a way that you couldn't possibly teach them, right?
Yeah.
No generations before could teach them. They would that is they had to self-learn that. Yeah.
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 Absolutely. And let's hope that continues.
Mm.
So what's next for you?
Um, I'm gonna try and paint more. Honestly, you're listening to this podcast got me recognizing how starved that I am for my own creative practice, right? Um, Things are accelerating. We're very, very busy. I'm in three places at once all the time, and we're moving into this house in the Netherlands, and the entire attic is set up to be my painting studio. And I had this painful, I had this painful realization going through some of my art supplies and like seeing all the paints that had dried up, right? Because I haven't touched them in so long. So that's definitely on my priority list for 2025 is to reconnect with my own practice, right? And to reconnect with that, back to the that David Lynch analogy, right? About like diving into the subconscious and diving into, themes and ideas that are seemingly disconnected, but we connect them in sort of the most deeply creative parts of our brain. I actually feel like engaging in that practice this year is gonna help me in my professional practice, right?
Yeah.
And it's something I try and reinforce with younger strategists, is that if you don't make time to fill that creative well, if you, and even if that act of that creative practice is reading, or going to a museum, or seeing a panel talk that you have been
Yeah.
wanting to see, even if your inputs are provocative analytical inputs, you are still feeding your creative mind, by carving out time to do those things.
Yes, you
And
are. You
that's,
are.
as a manager of young people, that is a really, it's a high priority for me, because ultimately,
Yes.
if you expend your well, you don't have anything to give to the work.
Hmm.
Even if the work is, the work of capital, you still don't have anything to give to it. You aren't primed to be that truth teller. You aren't primed to, um, you know, to um, to connect those dots. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if you then, because you have to always take care of your curiosity and be engaged with broader cultures in the world, you really do. Like you said, it could be anything, that's the exciting part. It can be anything, and you have to use your own inner compass to find those things. But I think that when you do, yeah, absolutely, that's what nourishes the mind and the soul,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
therefore you're far likelier to have that insightful idea that's based on the truth that you speak of. And I think that's
Yeah.
really, really profound.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that liminal space that kind of bridges personal creativity and sort of professional practice, right? That ability to sort of bridge the two worlds and tell the truth. If you aren't giving young people that space, and if you're not giving them a safe place to do that, like, that's the other, I think, piece of being a manager of sort of creative minds, right? Is that you need to make you need to make that space safe, right?
Yeah,
And sacred a little bit. And you need to be able to say to them, part of the creative process is making mistakes, right? It's screwing up.
yeah,
And just having the lack of ego attachment to the work to say, hey, I think I screwed this up, or hey, I think I could have done this better, or hey, how would you have done this, right? And to learn that way, to learn from error, because, and also innovation. I mean, innovation is about making mistakes.
it's
It
it
is.
relies on it.
It's
Yeah,
about iterative improvement and iterative optimization, and listening inputs, fresh inputs,
Mhm.
to sort of come to the solution. And if you're not making errors in your innovation practice, because that is also a very, very creative practice, right? You're not innovating, probably, right?
Yep, 100%. Yeah, perfectionism is a huge blocker,
Oh,
particularly in organizations,
oh, it's the worst.
and yeah, embedded cultures of thinking, and yeah, yeah, you really do have to break those down.
Mm.
Well, it's just been an absolute joy, Jennifer. I've loved talking to you, and
Oh, I'm
thank
glad.
you. Yeah,
I'm a,
ever
I'm a
so
bit of a
much.
I'm a bit of a rabbit hole person.
Oh, I know, me
So,
too, me too. So I enjoyed it so much.
yeah, me too. This was great, and it was actually, it's great not only to be, to sort of have listened to some of your work in, the podcast space, but also to sort of remind myself of some of the things that I remind my teams,
Yeah,
which is, it's kind of like the creative version of putting on your oxygen mask before you put the oxygen mask on anyone else, right? It's like,
yeah.
you have to take care of your creative self, before you can use it to solve anybody else's problems.
Cheers for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jen. Massively appreciate her taking the time from a busy schedule at Mark's. Great agency, by the way. Go and check out their body of work. Really cool stuff. Give me a second. I'll get you the URL. Makemarks.com. Doing a lot of cool stuff. Check them out now and go and have a look at the work from Musa too. Really inspiring, important stuff. We covered a lot of ground in that one, didn't we? Hit me up if anything resonated with you out of that. I'd love to hear from you guys, and it's not always the case. And I know that. I don't engage with all the podcasts I listen to. I kind of chew through them and I'll mention them to friends, but I don't always take the time to reach out to them unless there's a real reason to do so. But if you want to, I'd love to hear from you. I can get lonely in this little garden studio sometimes. I'm always happy to chat creativity. Do check out the founding sponsor of the show, illustrationx.com, for all your illustration and animation needs. They're a great agency with a hell of a roster, doing a lot of good work for the industry. Please do take a moment to support the Ukrainian Institute, who are supporting the Ukrainian creative community in this horrific time of war, ui.org.ua. Share their artists, commission them, everything in between. It all goes a long way. If you're interested in the coaching, I love working with you guys. It doesn't matter if you're an artist, designer, photographer, musician. I will work with anyone. Way outside of the arts as well. Happy to come into businesses, give you the lowdown. I've got a big talk and workshop on the creative condition called The Creative Condition, where we go through the nuts and bolts, the makeup of creativity. I have workshops as an option with exercises in there. It could just be a talk and a Q&A. Work one-to-one with your staff, work one-to-one with freelancers. I love all of it. Drop me a note. Let me know where you're up to, your budget, your needs. We'll work something out. Very flexible. Cheers for listening, guys. Big thank you again to Jennifer Murtell and Red Setter PR for setting that one up. Great little agency. Go and check them out. Appreciate you all. Stay creative. Have a great week.